The temperature in the cockpit, rising past survivable limits. The controls, locked in a death spiral. The crew's training, utterly useless for what was about to happen. In 40 seconds, 5 men would learn that their own aircraft was more lethal than enemy fighters. This is November 1942, somewhere over the Eastern Front, and Oberleutnant Klaus Hahn is about to discover that the greatest threat to German bomber crews isn't Soviet flak or Yak fighters. It's the machine they're strapped inside. This is the story of the Heinkel He-177, Nazi Germany's attempt to build a strategic bomber that could rival the British Lancasters and American B-17s. But it's really about what happens when political pressure, engineering compromise, and institutional denial combine to create something that kills more of your own people than the enemy ever could. And what it reveals about the gap between ambition and reality, between what a nation desperately needs and what its systems are actually capable of producing. Because sometimes the most dangerous lie isn't the one you tell your enemies, it's the one you tell yourself. February 1936. The Reich Air Ministry issues a specification that will haunt German aviation for the next 9 years. They want a bomber, not just any bomber, a Langstrecken bomber, a long-range strategic bomber, capable of reaching deep into Soviet territory, carrying 2 tons of bombs, achieving 500 kilometers per hour, and here's the part that will doom everything that follows, capable of dive bombing. Read that again. A heavy bomber that can dive bomb. It's like demanding a freight train that can also perform gymnastics. The specification itself is a window into the ideological fever dream consuming German military planning. They've seen the success of the Stuka dive bomber, watched it terrorize ground targets with pinpoint accuracy, and they've made a logical leap that feels reasonable until you understand physics. If dive bombing works for a small, agile aircraft, why not scale it up? Why not make everything dive bomb? This is where engineering reality and political fantasy begin their collision course. Ernst Heinkel receives the contract, not because his design is superior, but because he's willing to attempt the impossible. Other manufacturers look at the dive bombing requirement and politely suggest it might be reconsidered. Heinkel, eager for the prestige and the Reich's money, says yes. Yes, we can build a heavy bomber that dive bombs. Yes, we can make it fast enough, strong enough, capable enough. Yes becomes the first lie in a cascade of lies that will kill hundreds of German airmen. The design that emerges is ambitious, radical, and compromised from conception. To meet the speed requirements, Heinkel decides on a twin-engine configuration, but here's the problem. Twin engines won't generate enough power for a bomber this size. The solution Heinkel proposes is elegant in theory, catastrophic in practice. They'll use 4 engines, but mount them in pairs, 2 engines driving a single propeller on each wing. Coupled engines, they call it, Doppelmotoren. On paper, it's brilliant. You get the power of 4 engines with the aerodynamic drag of 2 propeller installations. Reduced drag means higher speed. Higher speed means you meet the Air Ministry's requirements. Higher speed means you get the contract. But coupled engines create a problem that no amount of engineering elegance can solve. Heat. 2 massive Daimler-Benz engines mounted side by side in a single nacelle, each producing over 1,000 horsepower, each generating enormous thermal energy, sharing a confined space with inadequate cooling, surrounded by fuel lines, hydraulic systems, and electrical wiring. It's not an engine installation. It's a bomb waiting for ignition. The first prototype flies in November 1939. Within minutes, the test pilot reports anomalous temperatures. Within hours, engineers are documenting cooling deficiencies. Within weeks, everyone involved knows they have a fundamental problem. And here's where the story stops being about engineering and starts being about psychology, about institutions, about the human capacity for denial when admitting the truth carries unbearable costs. Because by 1939, Germany is at war. The Luftwaffe desperately needs a strategic bomber. The He-177 is the only candidate. Contracts have been signed, factories prepared, resources allocated, reputations staked. The coupled engine configuration is the entire design's foundation. Changing it would mean starting over. Starting over would mean years of delay. Years of delay would mean admitting failure. Admitting failure would mean consequences no one wants to face. So instead, they proceed. They tell themselves the cooling problems are solvable. Just a matter of refinement, adjustment, improved ducting, better materials. They tell themselves every new aircraft has teething troubles. The Spitfire had problems. The Messerschmitt had problems. This is normal. This is manageable. This is the cognitive trap that will kill more German airmen than enemy action. When you've invested too much to turn back, when the political cost of honesty exceeds the perceived risk of continuation, when your career depends on success, evidence of failure stops feeling like information. It feels like enemy attack. Test flights continue through 1940 and 1941. The reports accumulate. Engine fires, not occasional, frequent, not minor, catastrophic. Pilots report flames visible from the cockpit. Heat so intense, it warps metal, fires that start without warning and spread faster than extinguishing systems can respond. Some flights end with successful landings despite fires. Others end with crews bailing out over Germany itself, their own bomber burning beneath them, no enemy having fired a shot. Mechanics nickname it the Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, the Luftwaffe's lighter. Air crews, with the dark humor of men facing death, call it the flaming coffin. But officially, in reports climbing the chain of command, it's described as an aircraft with technical difficulties requiring further development. Listen to the language carefully. Technical difficulties. As if the problem is a faulty gauge or a loose connection. As if men aren't burning alive in an aircraft their own country built. This is how institutions hide catastrophe behind bureaucratic language. This is how abnormal becomes normal. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, receives the reports. He's told the He-177 has problems. He's told development is behind schedule. He's told crews are reluctant to fly it. He responds predictably, not by questioning the design, not by demanding a fundamental reassessment, by blaming the people. The engines are fine, he declares. The problem is sabotage, defeatism, cowardice. He orders investigations into factory workers, into test pilots, into anyone who might be undermining the program. Because in Göring's world, in the ideological bubble of Nazi leadership, German engineering cannot fail. Therefore, if something appears to be failing, the fault must lie with Germans who aren't German enough. This is the institutional insanity that compounds the engineering disaster. Not only is the design flawed, but the system is incapable of acknowledging the flaw. Production begins anyway. By 1942, He-177s are rolling out of factories at Oranienburg and Wien. Crews are assigned. Training begins. And now the psychological weight shifts from engineers and test pilots to operational airmen. These are men who've been told they're receiving Germany's most advanced bomber. They've seen the propaganda, read the specifications, been assured this aircraft will allow them to strike targets the Luftwaffe has never been able to reach. Then they see it. Then they fly it. Then they experience what it means to sit inside an aircraft that might immolate you without warning. Hauptmann Werner Baumbach, a decorated bomber pilot, flies the He-177 and writes with barely contained fury about what he finds. The coupled engines overheat constantly. Oil leaks are chronic. Fires break out with terrifying regularity. The dive-bombing capability that justified the entire design? Unusable. The airframe can't handle the stress. Attempts to dive-bomb result in structural failure or loss of control. They've built a bomber that can't perform its primary mission and actively tries to kill its crew. But here's what makes Baumbach's account so psychologically revealing. He doesn't just describe technical failures, he describes the corrosion of trust. Air crews, he writes, lose confidence, not just in the aircraft, in their commanders, in the institution. When you order men to fly aircraft they know are death traps, when you dismiss their concerns as defeatism, when you prioritize production numbers over survival, you destroy something more critical than machines. You destroy belief. And belief is what keeps men fighting when logic says to run. November 1942. The He-177 enters operational service with Kampfgeschwader 40, tasked with attacking Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The results are immediate and catastrophic. Of the first operational missions, more aircraft are lost to mechanical failure than enemy action. Engines catch fire on takeoff. Hydraulic systems fail mid-flight. Landing gear collapses under the aircraft's weight. And always, constantly, the fires. Some crews complete missions successfully. They drop their bombs, evade enemy fighters, navigate back to base, only to have their aircraft burst into flames during landing rollout. Others never leave German airspace before fire forces emergency landings. The operational reports make grim reading. Mission after mission aborted due to engine fires, crews refusing to fly without extensive pre-flight inspections that reveal problems mechanics can't fix because the problems are fundamental to the design. Replacement aircraft arriving at units only to catch fire during ground testing. This is an Air Force at war, and one of its primary bombers is effectively combat incapable. Think about what this means logistically, psychologically, strategically. Germany has invested enormous resources into the He-177. Factories that could be building Bf-109 fighters or Ju-88 medium bombers are instead producing aircraft that operational units consider unflyable. Skilled air crews, irreplaceable in 1942 as German pilot training programs struggled to keep pace with losses, are being killed not by enemy action, but by their own equipment. The opportunity cost is staggering. Every hour spent on the He-177 is an hour not spent on something that works. But sunk cost fallacy is as powerful in warfare as in any human endeavor. The more you've invested in a failing course of action, the harder it becomes to abandon it. Abandoning the He-177 would mean admitting the entire program was a mistake. It would mean facing the reality that Germany spent years and vast resources on an aircraft that contributed more to its own defeat than to enemy losses. So instead, modifications, endless modifications. Engineers redesign cooling systems, reroute fuel lines, add fire suppression equipment, strengthen airframes, adjust engine mounting. Some modifications help marginally. Most are like applying bandages to a structural crack. The fundamental problem, the coupled engine configuration in an inadequate nacelle, remains, because fixing that would mean redesigning the entire aircraft, and redesigning would mean starting over, and starting over is the one thing the system cannot permit. By 1943, the Eastern Front is collapsing. Stalingrad has fallen. The Soviets are advancing. The Luftwaffe desperately needs strategic bombing capability to hit Soviet production centers beyond the reach of medium bombers. The He-177 is supposed to be that capability. Units equipped with the He-177 are sent east. The results are predictably disastrous. Missions against Soviet industrial targets are hampered not by enemy defenses, but by aircraft that can't complete flights. Crews report that fear of their own engines exceeds fear of Soviet fighters. At least fighters you can evade or fight. Your own aircraft catching fire allows no response except prayer and proximity to a parachute. Some missions do succeed. Some He-177s reach their targets, drop their bombs, and return safely. These successes are trumpeted in reports, used as evidence that the critics are wrong, that the aircraft just needs proper handling, proper maintenance, proper crew training. This is confirmation bias in its purest form, survivorship bias, the focus on successes while systematically ignoring the pattern of failures. The aircraft that don't catch fire are proof the design works. The aircraft that do catch fire are anomalies, bad luck, user error. Anything except what they actually are, which is predictable outcomes of a flawed design. Winter 1943 into 1944. The He-117 is deployed against England in Operation Steinbock, the so-called Baby Blitz, a last desperate attempt to strike at British cities with strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe assembles its largest bomber force in years, including significant numbers of He-177s. This is supposed to be the aircraft's vindication, its chance to prove it can perform the strategic mission it was designed for. The operation is a catastrophe. He-177s suffer mechanical failures at rates that shock even veterans of the aircraft's troubled history. Engines catch fire over the English Channel, forcing crews to ditch in freezing water or attempt emergency landings at forward bases. British night fighters, guided by radar, intercept bomber formations with devastating effect. But the losses to mechanical failure match or exceed the losses to enemy action. Crews flying the He-177 over England face a unique psychological horror. They're flying an aircraft that might kill them before the enemy gets a chance. They're navigating through searchlights and flak in a machine they fundamentally distrust. Every vibration might be catastrophic failure beginning. Every temperature fluctuation might be fire starting. The mental strain is immense. This isn't the stress of combat. Combat stress comes from external threats you can understand, react to, potentially overcome. This is different. This is the stress of helplessness, of being betrayed by your own tools, of knowing your institution valued production schedules over your survival. One pilot's account captures it perfectly. He describes flying the He-177 over England, bombs released, heading for home, when the starboard engine catches fire. Standard procedure is to feather the propeller, activate fire suppression, shut down the engine. He does all of this. The fire continues. It spreads. The nacelle is glowing red, visible even through the darkness. He has two choices: stay with the aircraft and try to reach the French coast, possibly dying when the wing burns through, or bail out over England and spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He chooses the parachute. 5 men exit the aircraft. 4 survive. As he descends through the darkness, watching his bomber spiral into the channel, he writes that his dominant emotion isn't fear or relief. It's rage. Rage at the people who built this. Rage at the system that sent him to fly it. Rage at the lies that called it operational when everyone knew it wasn't. This is what institutional betrayal looks like. When the organization you've pledged your life to values its own face-saving over your existence. When the truth becomes dangerous to speak because it contradicts official narrative. When evidence is systematically ignored because accepting it would require admitting systemic failure. By mid-1944, even the most optimistic assessments can't hide reality. The He-177 has one of the highest loss rates in the Luftwaffe, and most losses have nothing to do with enemy action. Operational units quietly resist assignments involving the aircraft. Crews request transfers. Mechanics document problems knowing nothing will be done. The gap between official reports and actual conditions becomes a chasm. But in Berlin, in the Air Ministry, in Göring's headquarters, the He-177 remains officially a successful aircraft requiring only minor improvements. Reports are written describing its potential. Plans are made for upgraded variants. Production continues. This is organizational psychosis, the complete detachment from reality that occurs when ideology, ego, and sunk costs override observable evidence. Some engineers never stopped trying to fix it. They knew the coupled engines were the problem. They proposed uncoupled versions, 4 separate engines in 4 nacelles, conventional configuration, proven design. These proposals were rejected. Too radical, too expensive, too much delay. The system preferred a failed design it had committed to over a working design that would require admitting the commitment was wrong. A small number of uncoupled engine He-177s were eventually built, designated the A5 variant. test flights showed immediate improvement. Engine fire rates dropped dramatically. Performance improved. Crews actually wanted to fly it, but by then it was 1944. Allied strategic bombing had shattered German production. Fuel was scarce, trained crews scarcer. The war was lost. The successful version of the He-177 arrived after it could matter, a monument to years wasted on a version everyone knew was fatally flawed. The final accounting is grim. Germany produced over 100 He-177 bombers. Of these, the majority were lost to accidents, mechanical failures, and non-combat causes. The percentage lost to engine fires alone exceeds the combat loss rates of most other German aircraft. Some estimates suggest more He-177 crew members died in accidents than in combat operations. Think about what this represents in human terms. Over 1,000 families receiving notifications that their sons, fathers, brothers died in aviation accidents, not shot down by the enemy, not killed in glorious combat, dead because the aircraft they were ordered to fly was fundamentally unsafe, and the institution knew it and sent them up anyway. This is the banality of institutional evil, not dramatic war crimes, just bureaucrats approving production runs, engineers following orders, commanders prioritizing mission statistics over crew safety, everyone doing their job while men burn. The He-177 reveals something about how systems fail, not suddenly, not dramatically, but through accumulation. Each person makes a small compromise. Each report softens the truth slightly. Each warning is dismissed as pessimism. Each death is rationalized as acceptable loss. And slowly, incrementally, the organization detaches completely from reality. By 1945, as Germany collapses, a few He-177s remain operational. They fly last desperate missions, knowing the war is lost, knowing the aircraft might kill them before they reach target. Some crews survive to surrender, others burn. The final He-177 missions are flown in April 1945, days before German surrender. There's something profoundly futile about those last flights. All the death, all the wasted resources, all the compromised engineering, all the institutional denial, and in the end, it changes nothing. But here's what makes the He-177 story important beyond just aviation history. It's a case study in how organizations handle uncomfortable truth. The truth was evident from the first test flights in 1939. The coupled engine configuration created unacceptable fire risk. The dive bombing requirement was unrealistic for an aircraft this size. The entire design needed fundamental rethinking. Everyone involved knew this at some level, but admitting it carried costs, political costs, career costs, the cost of abandoned investment, the psychological cost of admitting you were wrong. So instead of truth, there was management, problem redefinition, blame shifting, incremental fixes that addressed symptoms while ignoring the disease, official optimism masking private despair. And men died. Not because Germany couldn't build good aircraft. They built excellent fighters, effective medium bombers, innovative jets. Not because German engineers lacked skill. They had some of the world's best. Men died because the system that directed those engineers was incapable of accepting failure. Because Nazi ideology taught that German will and German genius could overcome any obstacle. Because admitting the He-177 was fundamentally flawed would mean admitting the system that produced it was flawed. There's a broader lesson here about certainty. The He-177 was born from certainty that dive bombing was the future, certainty that coupled engines would work, certainty that problems were solvable through determination. That certainty killed people. Not uncertainty, not doubt, certainty. The absolute conviction that made reconsidering impossible. If the engineers, the commanders, the Air Ministry officials had been less certain, if they'd been willing to say we don't know if this will work, we need to test the fundamental assumptions, We need to be willing to abandon this if evidence suggests we should. Hundreds of men might have lived. But certainty doesn't permit that kind of flexibility. Once you're certain, evidence against your position isn't information. It's opposition. Klaus Hahn, the pilot from our opening, survived the war. He flew the He-177 on multiple missions, experienced engine fires twice, lost crew members to mechanical failures. After the war, interviewed about his experiences, he said something that captures the entire story. We knew it was flawed. Everyone knew. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. The engineers knew. Even the commanders knew, though they couldn't admit it. We flew it anyway because that's what you did. You followed orders. You trusted the system. You believed that someone somewhere up the chain of command had good reasons for the decisions being made. That trust, he said, was the casualty he mourns most. Not the friends he lost, though he mourns them deeply, but the trust, the belief that his country, his Air Force, his commanders valued his life enough to not waste it. The He-177 taught him that organizations can be systemically indifferent to individual survival when institutional priorities conflict with individual well-being. It's a lesson he carried the rest of his life, a lesson about the gap between what institutions say they value and what their actions reveal they actually prioritize. Today, surviving He-177s exist in museums, carefully preserved explanatory plaques describing their specifications, their intended role, their operational history. The plaques mention the engine fire problem, usually briefly, framed as a technical challenge that was eventually addressed. They rarely convey the human cost, the pilots who burned, the crews who bailed out over enemy territory because their own aircraft was more dangerous than enemy fighters. The institutional denial that continued sending men up in aircraft everyone knew were death traps. Walking past a He-177 in a museum, you're looking at more than a failed aircraft design. You're looking at physical evidence of how systems fail, how certainty becomes liability, how institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals, how the gap between official narrative and operational reality can persist for years, how compromise, accumulated incrementally, produces catastrophe. The He-177 was supposed to be Germany's answer to the British Lancaster, the American B-17. It was supposed to give the Luftwaffe strategic reach, the ability to strike deep into enemy territory and return safely. Instead, it became an illustration of everything wrong with Nazi Germany's approach to technology, truth, and human life. It valued ideology over evidence, propaganda over reality, institutional face-saving over crew survival, and, in doing so, it built an aircraft that killed more Germans than it did enemies. There's a question that haunts the He-177 story. How many people, at how many points in the development and production process, knew the truth and stayed silent? How many engineers wrote reports softening the severity of problems? How many commanders received warnings and chose not to escalate them? How many pilots privately considered the aircraft unflyable, but flew it anyway because refusing would mean courts-martial? The answer is probably hundreds, maybe thousands, each making small compromises, each telling themselves they didn't have the full picture, each assuming someone else, someone higher up, would make the hard decisions, and collectively, through individual inaction, they sustained a program that killed their colleagues. This is how institutional failure works, not through dramatic villainy, through widespread passive complicity, through everyone doing their job while the larger system fails. The He-177 Greif, named for the mythological griffin, a creature that never existed. Perhaps the name was more appropriate than intended. The Greif was a myth, too. The myth that you could build a heavy bomber that dive bombs. The myth that coupled engines would work despite evidence they wouldn't. The myth that determination could overcome physics. The myth that good Germans flying German aircraft couldn't be outmatched by the enemy's inferior designs. Every one of those myths killed people. Some myths are harmless. Some are expensive. And some climb to 10,000 meters, with a crew of 5 and catch fire over the channel. Those myths don't just cost money or pride, they cost lives. And the people who died in He-177s died not for their country, but for their country's unwillingness to admit error. That's the legacy, not an aircraft. A lesson about the mortal cost of institutional pride, about what happens when systems value being right over getting it right, about the gap between official history and actual experience, about how you can believe something so completely that reality itself feels like betrayal when it proves you wrong, and about the fact that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't across the battle lines. Sometimes it's the comfortable lie your own side tells itself. The He-177 was that lie given form, given engines, given wings. And men climbed aboard that lie and flew it into fire because their institution demanded it and their culture taught them not to question. They deserved better. They deserved an aircraft that worked. They deserved commanders who valued truth over propaganda. They deserved a system that prioritized their survival over its own ego. They got the Greif instead. Germany's secret superbomber, the aircraft that was supposed to win the air war, the flying Firetrap that became a monument to everything wrong with building weapons in an empire of lies.